Margaret Sullivan stood at the gleaming entrance of the Pemberton Tower, one of the most exclusive commercial buildings in the downtown district, dressed in worn layers that had seen too many cold nights and clutching a tattered canvas bag that held everything she appeared to own. The winter morning bit through her thin jacket as she approached the pristine glass doors, gathering her courage to ask the impeccably dressed building manager, Richard Pemberton, if she might clean the lobby floors in exchange for a few hours of warmth. Richard looked at her with undisguised disgust, his eyes traveling from her weathered face to her scuffed boots with contempt that made the morning crowd of wealthy tenants pause in their routes to their corner offices. He mocked her appearance with cutting remarks, questioned her audacity for even approaching his building, and threatened to call security to have her removed and possibly arrested. The gathering audience watched as he publicly humiliated her, using her as a living example of the type of person who did not belong anywhere near the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of his pristine establishment. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew as they watched this woman bow her head in apparent shame, was that Margaret was not just another homeless woman seeking shelter from the cold. She was the actual owner of the entire building, every floor, every office, every gleaming surface that Richard took such pride in protecting. And what was about to happen next would change everything. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Sullivan stood in the pre-dawn shadows across the street from the Pemberton Tower, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she observed the building she had purchased 20 years ago, when it was nothing more than a struggling property with half its floors vacant and a reputation for neglect. She had poured her heart and resources into transforming it into one of the most sought-after addresses in the entire city. But she had always remained anonymous, allowing management companies to handle the daily operations while she focused on her other properties and investments. Today was different. Today she was here because of the anonymous complaints that had been arriving at her lawyer's office for the past 6 months, detailed accounts of how homeless individuals were being treated by the current building management. Stories of cruelty and dismissal that had made her physically ill when she read them. She had decided that the only way to truly understand what was happening was to experience it herself, to see firsthand whether the complaints were exaggerated or if they represented a systemic failure of the compassion she had always insisted her properties embody. She watched as a sleek black luxury car pulled up to the entrance just as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the glass facade gold, and Richard Pemberton emerged, immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit and signature crimson tie that he straightened with practiced precision. Margaret's stomach tightened as she observed him approach the entrance where a homeless man had been sleeping against the wall, his few belongings gathered in a careful pile beside him. Richard's face twisted with disgust as he used his expensive leather shoe to kick the man's belongings aside, scattering them across the sidewalk without even glancing down at the person he was displacing. The homeless man stirred but said nothing, his eyes reflecting a weary acceptance of this treatment that broke Margaret's heart. She took a deep breath, pulled her worn coat tighter around her body, and crossed the street with deliberate steps. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, timid and apologetic, as she approached Richard and asked if she might be allowed to clean the lobby floors in exchange for a few hours of warmth on this bitterly cold morning. Richard turned to look at her, his eyes cold and assessing, and his initial dismissal was delivered in a tone that was measured but unmistakably frigid, each word carefully chosen to establish the absolute distance between them and to make clear that her request was not just denied but fundamentally absurd. Richard's tone shifted from cold dismissal to something openly hostile, his voice rising in volume to ensure that the arriving tenants streaming through the entrance for their morning routines could hear every word of what he was about to say. He asked Margaret loudly if she thought this was some kind of charity organization, if she had any understanding whatsoever of what kind of establishment the Pemberton Tower actually represented in this city. Margaret remained calm and dignified despite the heat rising in her cheeks, her voice steady as she explained that she was willing to work very hard, that she had experience with cleaning, and would be grateful for any opportunity to earn her keep rather than simply asking for handouts. Richard laughed at this, a mocking sound that carried across the marble lobby and caused several well-dressed tenants to pause in their trajectories toward the elevators, their curiosity piqued by the spectacle unfolding near the entrance. He gestured dramatically at Margaret's appearance, pointing out her worn jacket and the frayed edges of her sleeves, asking the gathering audience if they truly believed someone who looked like this could possibly know how to operate the sophisticated modern cleaning equipment that the Pemberton Tower employed. He suggested with dripping condescension that she probably thought cleaning still involved a simple mop and bucket, that she had no concept of the computerized floor buffers and specialized chemical systems that were required to maintain floors of this caliber. A young woman in a neat professional dress stood near the reception desk, her nameplate identifying her as Claire Morrison, assistant manager, and her face showed visible discomfort as she watched the confrontation unfold. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, her hands clasping and unclasping in front of her, as though she wanted to intervene but could not quite summon the courage to contradict her superior. More tenants had stopped now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene, and their expensive briefcases and designer handbags held close as they watched this morning entertainment, with expressions ranging from uncomfortable sympathy to cold agreement with Richard's assessment. Margaret stood perfectly still, her shoulders straight despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her, her eyes meeting Richard's gaze with a quiet dignity that seemed to irritate him even further, as though her refusal to crumble completely under his verbal assault was itself an act of defiance that demanded escalation. Richard's aggression intensified, his face flushing with self-righteous anger as he pointed an accusing finger at Margaret and declared that she was part of a larger problem that had been plaguing this entire district for far too long. He turned to address the growing audience, explaining with sweeping gestures that people like her were the reason good tenants were considering leaving, that their presence on the streets and near the entrances of premium properties was actively driving down property values and destroying the carefully cultivated atmosphere that made this neighborhood desirable. He pulled his phone from his inner jacket pocket with theatrical flourish, holding it up so everyone could see as he announced that he was going to call the police immediately and have her arrested for trespassing on private property. Margaret's voice was quiet but clear as she asked if there was not room for compassion in a world that had so much. If treating another human being with basic dignity would truly damage his building's reputation. Richard's response was a condescending speech delivered with the passion of someone who believed absolutely in every word he was saying, explaining that he had worked his way up from nothing, that nobody had handed him anything, and that he understood better than anyone what it took to succeed in this world. He gestured expansively at the gleaming lobby around them, declaring that this building represented excellence, that it stood as a testament to what could be achieved through hard work and uncompromising standards. He explained that maintaining those standards was not cruelty but necessity, that allowing undesirables to loiter or even enter the premises would begin a slow erosion of everything he had worked so hard to build. The crowd had grown considerably larger now, with at least 20 people gathered in a wide circle, some nodding in agreement with Richard's words, while others looked increasingly uncomfortable with the display. Margaret noticed an elderly woman near the back whose eyes were glistening with tears, and a young man in an expensive suit who was recording the interaction on his phone with an expression of fascinated disgust. Richard continued his speech, his voice rising with passion, as he explained that compassion without boundaries was simply enabling, that true kindness meant maintaining order and standards so that hard-working people could enjoy the fruits of their labor without being confronted by the failures and poor choices of others. Through Richard's increasingly passionate rant, Margaret began to understand with a sinking feeling that this was not an isolated incident born of a particularly bad morning, but rather a deliberate pattern of behavior that he took genuine pride in implementing. He bragged openly to the assembled crowd about the strict policies he had put in place over the past several years, policies designed to identify and remove anyone who looked suspicious or out of place before they could make the building's legitimate occupants uncomfortable. He described with evident satisfaction how he had trained the security team to recognize potential problems, how they had removed dozens of individuals who had attempted to use the lobby restrooms or seek shelter in the parking garage during harsh weather. He spoke about protecting his tenants from the discomfort of having to encounter poverty and desperation on their way to their important meetings and valuable work. Claire stepped forward tentatively, her voice gentle as she suggested that perhaps they could find Margaret some assistance resources, that there were social services in the area that might be able to help her find proper shelter and support. Richard whirled on her with sudden fury, his voice sharp and cutting as he told her that this right here, was exactly why she would never make senior management. Because she was too soft, too willing to let emotions override sound business judgment. He told her in front of everyone that successful property management required a firm hand and clear boundaries, that her compassion was actually a weakness that would be exploited by every person looking for an easy mark. Claire's face flushed deep red, and she stepped back, her eyes dropping to the floor in humiliation. Margaret observed everything with an expression that was carefully unreadable, her face a mask of patient endurance, while her mind catalogued every word, every gesture, every revealing moment of Richard's philosophy of management. In the crowd, a distinguished-looking businessman with silver hair and an expression of growing discomfort shifted his weight and crossed his arms over his chest. His nameplate, visible on his briefcase, identified him as Thomas Wright. And unlike many of the other observers who were checking their watches and beginning to drift toward the elevators, he remained rooted in place, his troubled eyes moving from Richard's flushed face to Margaret's dignified stillness with an expression that suggested an internal struggle between the desire to intervene and uncertainty about the consequences of such intervention. Thomas Wright, who had maintained his company's offices in the Pemberton Tower for 15 years, and was generally known as a quiet, mild-mannered businessman who avoided confrontation whenever possible, surprised everyone by stepping forward from the crowd with sudden determination. He looked at Margaret with an expression of puzzlement, as though he recognized something familiar about her calm demeanor and the way she held herself with dignity despite the circumstances, but he could not quite place where he might have encountered her before. He addressed her directly, his voice kind and firm, offering to buy her breakfast at the cafe 2 blocks away where she could warm up, and perhaps they could discuss what resources might be available to help her situation. Richard intercepted immediately, stepping between Thomas and Margaret with a patronizing smile that did not reach his eyes. He warned Thomas in a tone that attempted friendliness, but carried an unmistakable edge that engaging with such people only encouraged them to return, that it created an expectation of handouts that would ultimately make the problem worse rather than better. Thomas, who had remained silent throughout Richard's earlier tirade, now spoke up with uncharacteristic firmness, saying that he found Richard's entire attitude troubling and that showing basic human kindness to someone in need was not enabling but simply being decent. Richard's expression transformed from patronizing patience to defensive anger, his shoulders squaring as he asserted his authority as building manager with considerable force. He reminded Thomas that he was responsible for maintaining the standards and reputation of the Pemberton Tower, that his decisions were guided by what was best for all tenants and the property value they had invested in. His voice took on a threatening quality as he suggested that perhaps Thomas should reconsider whether this building was the right fit for his company if he disagreed so fundamentally with how it was being run, that there were certainly other tenants who would appreciate his premium office space on the 12th floor. The confrontation between the two men created a moment of crackling tension in the lobby, with the assembled crowd going completely silent as they watched this unexpected challenge to Richard's authority unfold, while Margaret stood perfectly still between them, her eyes moving from one man to the other with an intensity that suggested she was committing every detail of this interaction to permanent memory. Richard turned his attention back to Margaret, his jaw set with absolute resolve, as he delivered his ultimatum in a voice loud enough for every person in the lobby to hear clearly. He announced that he was giving her exactly 1 minute to leave the premises voluntarily, or he would have her arrested for trespassing and harassment of both himself and the building's valued tenants. He pulled out his phone and made a show of setting a timer, the digital numbers beginning their countdown in a display of theatrical authority. Then he turned to address the gathered crowd directly, using Margaret as a living prop in his lecture about property management and maintaining standards. He spoke passionately about the prestige of the Pemberton Tower, about how it had become the premier address in the city, not by accident, but through careful cultivation and uncompromising commitment to excellence. He described the sacrifices required to keep a building of this caliber operating at the highest level, the constant vigilance needed to prevent the slow decay that came from lowered standards and misplaced compassion. He gestured at Margaret without looking at her directly, explaining that every building in the district faced these same challenges, but only the ones with strong management maintained their value and reputation. Margaret listened to every word with careful attention, her eyes moving slowly across the faces in the crowd, noting those who shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact, noting those who nodded in agreement with Richard's philosophy, noting the young mother who pulled her child closer as though Margaret might somehow contaminate them. She saw Claire standing near the reception desk with tears threatening to spill from her eyes, and Thomas Wright with his arms crossed and his expression dark with disapproval. Richard raised his hand and signaled to two security guards who had been standing near the elevators, and they began walking toward Margaret with professional efficiency, their hands resting near the equipment on their belts. Margaret's voice cut through the tension quietly but clearly as she asked Richard one final time if he was absolutely certain about the choice he was making, if this was truly how he wanted this morning to unfold. Richard met her eyes with complete confidence, his chin lifting as he declared that he had never been more certain of anything in his professional life, that this was exactly the kind of decisive action that separated successful managers from weak ones. Margaret turned to leave, her worn shoes making soft sounds against the pristine marble floor, but she paused long enough to look directly at Claire and thank her quietly for the kindness she had attempted to show, and her words sincere despite the humiliation of the past several minutes. She turned to Thomas Wright and acknowledged his offer of breakfast with quiet dignity, telling him that his willingness to help a stranger spoke well of his character. Richard could not resist one final mocking comment as she walked toward the glass doors, loudly suggesting that she return to wherever she came from and perhaps learn that not every building in the city would tolerate her attempts at manipulation through false humility. Margaret paused at the door, her hand resting on the gleaming brass handle, and she turned back to look at Richard with an expression that was utterly calm and somehow sad. She said softly that she would return, and when she did, things would be very different. Richard laughed loudly at this declaration, the sound booming across the lobby as he turned to the crowd and entertained them with exaggerated imitations of her words, putting on a show of her ragged appearance and her absurd confidence that she would somehow have any power to change anything about how the Pemberton Tower operated. The crowd's laughter was scattered and uncomfortable, but Richard seemed satisfied with the response. Margaret pushed through the door and disappeared into the cold morning air without looking back. Richard straightened his crimson tie with a gesture of finality and announced to the remaining onlookers that the situation had been handled appropriately, that this was what strong management looked like in practice. He returned to his office on the second floor, settling into his leather chair with a deep sense of satisfaction about how he had handled the situation, already composing the email he would send to the ownership group's representative about his decisive action in protecting the building's reputation. Claire remained at the reception desk, her face troubled and her hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus on her computer screen. Thomas Wright canceled his morning meeting with a brief text message and pulled out his phone to make a call to someone he had not spoken to in several years. Margaret walked several blocks through the downtown streets before turning into a quiet alley where a sleek, dark sedan waited with its engine running softly. She opened the rear door and slid inside, immediately beginning to remove the outer layers of worn clothing that had disguised her true circumstances. Beneath the tattered coat was a beautifully tailored cashmere sweater in deep navy, and her weathered bag contained a slim leather portfolio that spoke of wealth and sophistication. The driver, a distinguished man in his 60s named James, who had been with her for 30 years through her journey from poverty to prosperity, turned to look at her with concerned eyes and asked how it had gone. Margaret described the scene with sadness rather than anger, her voice heavy with disappointment as she recounted Richard's cruelty and the crowd's mixed reactions. She pulled out her phone and dialed her lawyer, Helen Pritchard, a formidable woman who had handled Margaret's legal affairs for 2 decades. Helen answered on the first ring, and Margaret explained in precise detail everything she had witnessed that morning. Every word Richard had spoken, every gesture of contempt he had displayed. Helen's voice was not surprised as she revealed that she had been quietly compiling complaints about Richard for the past several months, documentation from former employees and concerned tenants that painted a disturbing picture of his management style. Margaret asked Helen to prepare all the necessary documents for what would happen next. Her voice firm despite the emotional weight of the morning. She ended the call and looked at her reflection in the car window. Seeing both versions of herself superimposed in the glass, the woman she had been decades ago when she truly had nothing, and the woman she had appeared to be this morning, and she wondered if there was really any difference between them beyond circumstances and luck. She thought about why she had remained anonymous as an owner all these years, preferring to let management companies and representatives handle the public-facing aspects of her properties while she stayed in the background. Part of it had been a desire for privacy, but part of it had also been a test, a way to see how her buildings were truly run when people did not know the owner was watching, and this morning had revealed a failure more profound than she had imagined possible. Margaret spent the afternoon in her private office on the top floor of one of her other properties, reviewing the extensive documentation that Helen had prepared and organized into neat folders. There were complaints from former employees about Richard's treatment of service workers, detailed accounts of him screaming at janitors for minor infractions, berating maintenance staff in front of tenants, and creating an atmosphere of fear among anyone he considered beneath his station. There were reports from vendors who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Richard's business practices, specifically his habit of marking up their invoices and contracts before submitting them to the accounting department and pocketing the difference for himself. Margaret's hands tightened on the papers as she read testimonies from multiple tenants about his increasingly aggressive enforcement policies, stories of elderly residents being questioned about their guests, of delivery people being banned from using certain entrances, of an overall atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that had transformed the once welcoming building into something that felt more like a fortress. The most disturbing discovery came buried in the middle of the documentation. Multiple instances where Richard had told people he was the owner of the Pemberton Tower, not just the manager, apparently enjoying the prestige and power that came with that false claim. He had been making unauthorized policy changes without any approval from the actual ownership group, implementing fees for services that had always been included in the lease agreements, raising parking rates and security deposits beyond what was contractually allowed, and essentially running the building as his personal fiefdom. Margaret found 3 formal complaints that Claire had submitted through the proper channels, detailed and professional documents outlining her concerns about Richard's behavior and requesting intervention, but none of them had ever been forwarded to the ownership group or to Helen's office as they should have been. Richard had apparently intercepted them and buried them, ensuring that no one with actual authority would ever see the problems Claire was trying to report. Margaret set down the last folder and rubbed her temples, realizing with growing dismay that the situation was far worse than she had thought, that what she had witnessed this morning was not an aberration, but the visible tip of a much larger problem that had been festering for years. The next morning, Margaret returned to the Pemberton Tower at precisely 9 o'clock, still dressed simply in casual clothes but noticeably cleaner than the day before, her hair brushed and her face washed, and she carried a slim folder tucked under her arm. Richard spotted her the moment she walked through the glass doors, and his face transformed from its usual expression of professional authority to one of absolute fury as he stormed across the marble lobby toward her. He demanded to know if she truly wanted to be arrested. If yesterday's humiliation had not been enough of a lesson about where she belonged and what would happen if she continued to trespass on his property. Margaret's voice was calm and measured as she stated that she was not trespassing, that she had an appointment this morning and was simply here to keep it. Richard scoffed at this claim, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and contempt as he asked who would possibly agree to meet with someone like her, what kind of appointment she could possibly have in a building of this caliber. Margaret met his gaze steadily and replied with perfect composure that she had an appointment with the building owner to discuss matters of management and policy. Richard's expression shifted from anger to genuine amusement, and he laughed with real mirth at what he perceived as her desperate delusion. He announced loudly that the owner would never meet with someone like her, that the owner was an extremely important and busy person who certainly did not waste time on vagrant women spinning fantasies about appointments they did not have. He turned to the lobby, which was once again filling with morning arrivals, tenants in their expensive suits and carrying their designer briefcases. And he shared this joke with them, inviting them to appreciate the absurdity of this homeless woman claiming to have a meeting with the building's owner. Several people smiled uncomfortably, while others simply hurried past toward the elevators, not wanting to be delayed by another scene. Claire stood near the reception desk again, her face pale and her expression anxious as she watched the confrontation unfold. Margaret remained perfectly patient, her posture relaxed and her breathing steady, and she glanced at the elegant clock mounted on the lobby wall, watching the minute hand move toward the appointed time. A sleek black town car pulled up outside the main entrance at precisely 9:15, and a formidable woman in her 60s emerged with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Helen Pritchard was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her silver hair styled in a sophisticated cut, and she carried an elegant leather briefcase that spoke of serious business and considerable authority. Richard did not recognize her, but he immediately noted her obvious wealth and the way she moved with absolute confidence. And his expression shifted to one of professional curiosity. Helen entered the lobby through the doors that a security guard rushed to open for her, and she walked directly across the marble floor to where Margaret stood, waiting, greeting her warmly by name with genuine affection in her voice. Richard's expression became confused, his eyes moving from Helen to Margaret and back again, as he tried to understand the connection between this obviously powerful woman and the person he had humiliated and ejected just yesterday. Helen turned to look at Richard with an assessing gaze and introduced herself in a voice that carried across the lobby as the attorney for the Pemberton Tower's ownership group. Richard's entire demeanor transformed instantly from confusion to obsequious professionalism. His back straightening and his smile becoming wide and ingratiating, he stepped forward with his hand extended, apologizing profusely if there had been any confusion about anything, explaining that he had not been informed of any scheduled meetings and would of course have prepared properly if he had known someone from the ownership group would be visiting. Helen did not shake his hand, letting it hang in the air between them until he awkwardly withdrew it, and her expression remained ice-cold as she looked at him with the kind of penetrating stare that made grown men confess to things they had forgotten they had done. She stated in a tone that allowed for no discussion or delay that she required Richard to accompany them to the executive conference room on the top floor immediately, that there were matters of considerable importance that needed to be addressed without any further delay. Richard agreed instantly, his mind racing to understand what this could possibly be about, whether perhaps there was some complaint he needed to address or some new policy being implemented, and he gestured toward the elevators with a nervous smile. In the sleek conference room on the top floor, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and its polished table that could seat 20 people, Richard grew increasingly nervous as he settled into one of the leather chairs. He kept glancing at Margaret, who sat quietly at the far end of the table, her presence an unexplained puzzle that nagged at his mind, and he could not understand why he had not been informed of this meeting through the proper channels that governed all official business with the ownership group. Helen opened her briefcase with deliberate care and began asking pointed questions about building policies. Her voice sharp and precise as she inquired about his treatment of homeless individuals who approached the property, about complaints from vendors regarding invoice discrepancies, about unauthorized fee increases that several tenants had brought to the attention of the ownership group's representatives. Richard attempted to deflect these questions, his voice taking on a defensive tone, as he claimed that he had simply been protecting the building's interests, that every decision he had made was designed to maintain the property's value and reputation. Helen produced documents from her briefcase, sliding them across the polished table one by one, financial records and complaint letters and policy memos that Richard had written without proper authorization. Richard's confidence began to waver as he looked at the evidence laid out before him, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up one of the documents and recognized his own signature. He insisted with growing desperation that he had the authority to make these decisions as building manager, that his contract gave him considerable discretion in day-to-day operations and policy implementation. Helen corrected him in a voice that cut through his protestations like a blade through silk, stating that he had authority granted by the owner of the property, authority that was contingent on his faithful execution of his duties and adherence to the values that the owner expected, authority that could be revoked at any time if he failed to meet those expectations. Richard's face flushed with a mixture of fear and anger as he demanded to know why the owner was not present for this conversation, why he was being ambushed by an attorney, and questioned about decisions that had been made in good faith to protect the very investment the owner should be thanking him for safeguarding. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the conference table, observing the exchange with patient stillness, stood and moved with deliberate grace to the head of the table where the owner's chair sat empty. She removed her worn cardigan, revealing an elegant silk blouse beneath that probably cost more than Richard earned in a week, and she placed both hands flat on the polished surface as she looked directly at him. Her voice was clear and firm, carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority as she spoke. She was Margaret Sullivan, the sole owner of the Pemberton Tower and 6 other commercial properties throughout the city, and she had been the owner of this particular building for 20 years. Richard's face drained of all color, his skin taking on a grayish pallor as his mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. He began to stammer incoherently, trying to form an apology, claiming that he had not known, insisting desperately that there had been some kind of terrible misunderstanding. Margaret recounted yesterday's events in precise detail, her voice never rising but carrying the force of undeniable fact as she described every moment from her arrival to her departure. She quoted his exact words back to him, his comments about people like her driving away good tenants, his theatrical display with the phone timer, his mocking laughter as she left, his declaration that he had never been more certain of anything in his professional life. Richard attempted to explain with growing panic that he had simply been doing his job, that he was maintaining the standards that any property of this caliber required, that he had been protecting her investment even if she could not see it from her perspective. Margaret's voice was quiet but sharp as she asked him to define standards for her, to explain exactly what standards he believed he had been upholding by kicking aside a homeless man's belongings, by publicly humiliating someone asking for help, by threatening arrest for the crime of seeking warmth. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no coherent words emerged, his mind racing to find some explanation that would make sense of his actions, some justification that would transform cruelty into professional duty, but he could not form a response that did not sound hollow and pathetic even to his own ears. Helen produced a comprehensive file from her briefcase, thick with documentation that represented months of careful investigation, and she began laying out the evidence piece by piece across the conference table. There were photos taken by concerned citizens showing Richard kicking aside a homeless veteran's belongings outside the building entrance, the man's face clearly visible and etched with resignation. There were audio recordings captured on security cameras and cell phones of Richard mocking disabled individuals who struggled with the building's revolving doors, his voice dripping with contempt as he questioned why they bothered trying to enter places clearly not designed for people like them. There were financial records showing his systematic theft through inflated vendor invoices, a pattern that had netted him over $70,000 in the past 3 years alone. There were formal complaints from dozens of people, former employees who had quit rather than continue working under his abusive management, tenants who had chosen not to renew their leases because of the hostile atmosphere he created, service workers who had been reduced to tears by his cruelty. Richard tried desperately to defend himself, his voice rising to a near shout as he claimed that the recordings were illegal and could not be used against him, that the complaints were exaggerated by disgruntled former employees with axes to grind. Margaret remained perfectly calm throughout his protests, her hands still resting flat on the table as she waited for him to exhaust himself. She explained in a measured voice that she had owned this building since 2005, that she had personally hired Richard 10 years ago after an extensive interview process, specifically because he had seemed compassionate and hard-working, because he had spoken eloquently about treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. She asked him directly what had changed him, what had transformed him from the man she hired into the person who could kick aside another human being's belongings without a second thought. Richard had no answer, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words that would not come. He began to panic as the full weight of the situation crashed down on him, and he started begging for another chance with genuine desperation in his voice, explaining that he had a family, a mortgage, responsibilities that depended on his income. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression sad but resolute. Margaret explained in a voice that allowed no room for negotiation that Richard's employment was terminated immediately, effective as of this moment, and that security would escort him to his office to collect only his personal belongings under supervision. However, she continued after a pause that let the full weight of his termination sink in. She would not pursue legal charges for the theft if he agreed to certain conditions that were not negotiable. He must repay every dollar he had stolen through a structured payment plan that Helen would establish, with payments beginning within 30 days and continuing until the full amount, plus reasonable interest, had been returned. He must attend counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in addressing prejudices and the corrupting influence of power, sessions that would continue for a minimum of 6 months with proof of attendance required. He must volunteer at a homeless shelter for 1 full year, working directly with the population he had treated with such contempt, spending at least 10 hours per week learning about the circumstances that led people to need such services. Richard, terrified of criminal prosecution and the public shame that would come with it, agreed to everything with frantic nodding, his voice hoarse as he promised he would fulfill every condition exactly as specified. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face, as she explained that she believed deeply in rehabilitation rather than just punishment, that she thought people could change and grow if given the right circumstances and motivation. She asked him directly if he truly understood why what he had done was wrong, not just that it violated policies or damaged the building's reputation, but why it was fundamentally wrong on a human level. Richard was silent for a long moment, his hands trembling on the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He managed to articulate through his fear and shame that he had let power corrupt him, that somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing people and started seeing categories, that he had forgotten the fundamental value of every human being, regardless of their circumstances or appearance. He admitted that he had become the kind of person he would have despised 10 years ago, that he had used his authority not to serve but to elevate himself at the expense of others. After Richard was escorted out by 2 security guards who had watched the entire proceeding with expressions of grim satisfaction, Margaret asked Claire to join her in the conference room, gesturing to one of the chairs near the head of the table. Claire entered with visible nervousness, her hands clasped tightly in front of her and her face pale with anxiety, as she clearly assumed she was also being terminated for not doing more to stop Richard's behavior, despite her multiple attempts to report it. Instead, Margaret's first words were an offer of Richard's position as building manager, and Claire's shock was so profound that she had to sit down abruptly, her legs no longer able to support her. Margaret explained with warmth in her voice that she had read all 3 of Claire's formal complaints that Richard had buried, that she admired the young woman's attempts to show compassion even when it put her at odds with her superior, and that she believed Claire understood the values that should truly guide the building's management. She told Claire that the job would not be easy, that there would be resistance from some tenants who preferred Richard's harsh approach, but that she had faith in Claire's ability to lead with both strength and humanity. Claire accepted the position with tears streaming down her face, emotionally overwhelmed by the unexpected turn her morning had taken. Margaret spent the next hour outlining a new vision for the Pemberton Tower, one that would maintain its excellence and high standards, while also demonstrating that true prestige came not from exclusion but from how an establishment treated all people. They discussed implementing new policies that would balance security concerns with compassionate outreach, creating a fund from building revenues that would help people in crisis access resources and services, and providing comprehensive training for the security team in techniques of compassionate intervention that de-escalated situations without dehumanizing anyone involved. Claire took notes frantically, her mind already racing with ideas about how to transform the building's culture. And Margaret watched her with satisfaction, knowing that she had made the right choice in trusting this young woman with the responsibility of carrying forward a vision of management that valued people over appearances. Thomas Wright requested a meeting with Margaret later that afternoon, and when he entered the conference room, his expression was a mixture of wonder and gratitude that immediately caught her attention. He explained that he had finally remembered where he recognized her calm demeanor and distinctive presence from. And what he revealed next brought genuine surprise to Margaret's face. 20 years ago, when he was just starting his business from a tiny apartment and was nearly bankrupt after his initial investors pulled out, someone had anonymously paid his rent for 6 months through the building management company, giving him just enough breathing room to survive long enough for his ideas to gain traction and eventually succeed. He had tried desperately to find out who his benefactor was, and after months of investigation he had tracked it down to a woman named Margaret Sullivan, who owned several properties but maintained almost complete anonymity. He had never connected that Margaret Sullivan with the owner of the Pemberton Tower, in the building he had eventually moved his thriving company into 15 years later, never imagining that the person who saved his life decades ago was the same person who now owned the space where he employed over 50 people. He thanked her with tears in his eyes, explaining that he had tried to pay forward that kindness throughout his life, that her generosity had taught him that success meant nothing if you did not use it to help others. Margaret was deeply touched by his words, her own eyes glistening as she explained that she had started with absolutely nothing, sleeping in shelters and going days without adequate food, and that she knew intimately what it meant to be invisible, to be dismissed as worthless by people who judged only by appearances. She told him that when she finally achieved success, she had promised herself that she would never forget where she came from, that she would use her resources to create opportunities for others the way she wished someone had created them for her. She asked Thomas if he would be willing to serve on a new tenant advisory board she was creating, a group that would help guide the building's policies and ensure that the Pemberton Tower lived up to the values she wanted it to represent. Over the following weeks, the Pemberton Tower underwent a transformation that was both visible and cultural, touching every aspect of how the building operated and how people experienced it. A shelter partnership program began, with the building providing space in a ground-floor conference room for a weekly service center where people experiencing homelessness could access resources, counseling, job placement assistance, and medical screenings in a dignified environment. Security staff received comprehensive new training that focused on de-escalation techniques, recognizing signs of mental health crisis, and treating every person who entered the building with baseline respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. A kindness policy was formally adopted and posted in every elevator and common area, making it clear that the Pemberton Tower valued compassion and human dignity as highly as it valued professional excellence. Claire proved to be an exceptional manager, bringing a leadership style that was firm but fair, holding people accountable to high standards while never sacrificing their humanity in the process. Some tenants who had preferred Richard's harsh approach and felt uncomfortable with the new culture chose not to renew their leases, moving to buildings where the old exclusionary practices still prevailed. Others, like Thomas Wright, became passionate champions of the new direction, speaking publicly about how the changes had actually enhanced, rather than diminished, the building's reputation. Margaret visited regularly, sometimes arriving in her elegant business attire to attend meetings or review operations, and other times appearing in simple casual clothes to observe how people were treated when they appeared to have no power or status. She watched as security guards helped an elderly woman who had wandered in, confused, as Claire personally assisted a delivery person who had been injured, as tenants held doors for janitors and engaged them in friendly conversation. The building became known throughout the city, not just for its prestige and prime location, but for the principles it embodied, attracting a new generation of tenants who wanted to be part of an organization that demonstrated that success and compassion were not opposing values but complementary ones that elevated both business and humanity. 1 year later, Margaret received a handwritten letter from Richard, his careful script filling 3 pages with reflections that demonstrated genuine transformation rather than performative remorse. He reported that he had completed his volunteer requirement at the homeless shelter, but had chosen to continue serving there twice weekly because the work had become meaningful to him in ways he had not anticipated. He had paid back half of what he had stolen and was on track to complete full restitution within another 18 months. Most importantly, he wrote with raw honesty. He had learned to see people as individuals with complex stories rather than categories to be managed and dismissed. He described a moment several months earlier when a man had come to the shelter seeking assistance, and Richard had recognized him as someone he had cruelly dismissed from another building he had managed years before. The man did not recognize Richard. His attention focused entirely on the paperwork he was filling out and the hope that this time someone might actually help him, but Richard had recognized instantly his own past cruelty reflected back at him through this encounter. He had helped the man with genuine care and attention, and later that night had gone home and wept for all the people he had harmed through his arrogance and prejudice. He thanked Margaret with words that carried the weight of sincere gratitude for giving him consequences that had led to growth rather than just punishment, for believing that he could become better than his worst actions. He asked tentatively if she might someday consider providing a reference for him, not for a management position which he no longer felt qualified to hold, but for any honest work where he could earn his living without causing harm. Margaret read the letter twice, looking for signs of manipulation or false contrition, but found only genuine humility and hard-won wisdom. She wrote back within 2 days, offering him a maintenance position at one of her smaller commercial properties, a job that would allow him to rebuild his life while working under a manager who understood his history and would hold him accountable to continued growth. Margaret stood in the lobby of the Pemberton Tower on a cold winter morning, exactly 1 year after her confrontation with Richard, watching as Claire handled a situation with quiet competence and genuine compassion. A young woman had wandered in from the freezing streets, her clothes inadequate for the weather, and her eyes reflecting the kind of desperation that Margaret recognized instantly from her own past. Claire approached her with a warm smile, offering hot coffee from the lobby station, a phone to call social services, and most importantly, genuine respect that treated her not as a problem to be removed, but as a human being deserving of dignity. The young woman accepted the coffee with trembling hands and thanked Claire with tears streaming down her face, and Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion at the contrast between this scene and what would have unfolded under Richard's management. She reflected on how easy it was to judge people by their appearances, how power could corrupt even good people without constant vigilance and intentional connection to core values, how true excellence could never be separated from compassion without becoming hollow and ultimately meaningless. She thought about her own journey from poverty to wealth, from invisibility to influence, and how she had fought every day to stay connected to her humanity and remember what it felt like to be dismissed as worthless. The building was thriving now, not despite its kindness but because of it. With a waiting list of tenants who wanted to be part of an organization that stood for something beyond profit margins and exclusive addresses, treating people with dignity had not lowered the standards but raised them to include the most important standard of all: the measure of how an institution honored the humanity of every person who walked through its doors. Margaret understood now, more clearly than ever, that how we treat the most vulnerable among us reveals who we truly are beneath all the trappings of success and status, that our character is defined not by how we treat those who can benefit us, but by how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. She walked out into the cold morning air, still preferring her simple cardigan over the expensive coats hanging in her closet, knowing that true worth was never displayed on the surface, but lived out in the daily choices we make about kindness and cruelty, inclusion and exclusion, seeing or dismissing the humanity in others. This was what real success looked like, not the gleaming marble and crystal chandeliers, but the tears of gratitude in a stranger's eyes when someone finally treated her like she mattered. Everything else was just decoration.